All right, folks. Thank you so much for coming on today's webinar. You are tuning in for day 4 of 5 for NAHASDA Procurement and Contract Administration. We're coming to you live on March 27th, 2025. Our Catheta webinars, they get their name from Sorry about that, y'all. I got the boot for a second there. All right. If you could follow along while I read the disclaimer aloud, this webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. We also have our copyright infringement law printed here. So this is just a friendly reminder that the webinar materials are protected by copyright, trademark, trade secret, and other intellectual property laws. If you are new to the platform, know that you can find all of your course material, slides, recordings, past webinars that you maybe missed before you joined the platform. All that can be found in the courses section that you see circled here. But know that today's presentation slides are in the chat for you. They're available for download. Anytime you join a future webinar, you'll just log in during the actual webinar time, and you'll see a green banner at the top of your screen. You'll click on that, and that is how you join us. We do ask that you typically join with listen-only capabilities just to cut down on audio feedback. And if you do join and you realize that your audio is maybe not coming out of a speaker that you prefer to use, or maybe you have in headphones, but it's coming out loud from your laptop, whatever the situation may be, you can go down to the bottom of your screen and you can click on that little phone icon, and that's going to bring up a list of your mic devices as well as your speaker devices, so you can select the correct output. There's a few different ways for you to interact during today's webinar. We're going to primarily rely on the public chat. If you don't have that already expanded, you'll just click on it on this left-hand menu, the one in gray. It'll bring it up. If you have any questions, any comments, especially any tech support issues that I can help you with, you'll just click on that box, type your message in, and you can hit enter or click on the little paper airplane icon, and that'll send it in where we can all see it. If you asked a question and you feel like maybe we missed it, or it's a super important comment, you could use the raise your hand feature. But know that Cheryl will always address questions at the end. So still feel free to send them in. We can go through them at the end, but that is typically when they get addressed. And a lot of them she'll answer as she's going through her material. Let's go ahead and get the chat box going together. You can let us know your name, where you're tuning in from, your work or your role in Indian country that led you to attending today's webinar on procurement, as well as your tribal affiliation if you have one. And while y'all are firing up the chat box, it is with great pleasure that I introduce your webinar instructor, Cheryl A. Cosley. And Cheryl, I am handing it off to you now.
Oh, thank you so much. I still am not handed off yet, Brooke. There we go. Thank you so much, my girl. Okay, so welcome to day 4. We made it. We're almost done. Oh, one more thing here, and there we go. Okay. So, as she said, this is courtesy of the Native Learning Center and the Office of Native American Programs. Welcome. Good afternoon. Webinar is getting recorded. My information's at the beginning and the end. Should you guys ever need anything, reach out to me and I'll try to get your answer. Okay. My name is Cheryl Cosley. My Anishinaabe name is Redbird Woman. I am Loon Clan, and I come from Place of the Pike in my language, which means Kino-Shinkoning. That is the Bay Mills Indian community. Our reservation is located in Upper Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula. And our waters actually border Canada. We're Ojibwe or Chippewa people, referred to as both. And I served as director of housing for my tribe for over 28 years. During that time frame, I served as the chairperson for the Great Lakes Indian Housing Association, the 31 tribes surrounding the Great Lakes, for 7 years. And I served on the board of directors for the National American Indian Housing Council for 16 years. Started off as the secretary, did the roll calls almost for life until I became chair, and was the vice chair for many years, and then became a 2-term chairperson. I started Cheryl A. Cosley and Associates in March of 2019, and I provide training and technical assistance such as this, virtually and in person, all throughout the lower 48 and Alaska. I travel to Alaska a couple of times a year, so I'm very familiar with housing. I've been blessed to be able to continue to do what I love and help our people. So I hope you enjoy today's class. We've got presentations, participant materials, examples, references. We're going to hope, this objective, we meet those by, understanding, increasing your understanding of TDHE management operations, especially in relationship to procurement. Every once in a while, I'll go a different way and make sure you know that you got to do something else there too. Improved capabilities, proficiencies, job skills in the performance of your procurement functions. And utilize 2 CFR 200 quite a bit. So the description, is to basically make sure that you understand 2 CFR 200. The other times that you can go to the other 2 guidance documents are program guidances and notices. So I got off the webinar yesterday and I looked at my text messages, and it was one of my ladies I've worked with, at HUD for years and years and years. And she's got a procurement question, and where would I find it? And, it was in the area of bidding and big bid bonds and things like that. So there I was pouring through these documents. It's a good thing I'm a speed reader, because I was supposed to be going out the door, and able to answer the question anyway. So, that's what we do. We help each other. And the HUD office is always, always a good place to go for help. Depending upon the people that you work with, how long they've been there, you can always ask, and go up the chain, or they will do that on your behalf. So never feel afraid to reach out to them either. But there's, a lot of people here to help you. I know a lot of people will reach out to NLC and say, do you know the answer to this question? And then they go looking, so there's everybody wants you to succeed. So there's procurement documents and a lot of items in there that'll help you. So as she said, jot down your questions. I've got mine looking at a full screen because of the amount of materials that I sometimes show. So I don't see that chat box until I close up my last slide. So, but she can interrupt me. Today we're going to do non-competitive methods, quotation evaluations, the suspension and the debarment, some of our Indian preference requirements, procurement principles and standards, price and cost analysis, and the useful life and binding commitment. Please find out, make sure, if you guys are helping with basically almost anything over $5,000, that you are looking at that and the insurance requirements, because you don't want to get a finding. Tomorrow we'll finish up with environmental assessments and reviews. Your a subrecipient versus a contractor, you have to be able to identify which is which. You treat them both differently. Your procurement checklist for your files, your procurement procedures, that contract file arrangement, and then the GSA. So please make sure that you guys, ECFR Part 200, you got to know that. That's your baby for procurement, okay? The NAHASDA statute, you can print that. It doesn't really change. It's 58 pages long. That's the second place you would normally look to see if you can do something. And then those NAHASDA regulations, at least keep a copy on your desktop, okay? You got to have those to know what you can legally do and what you can't, Okay. NAHASDA procurement related regulations. That's where I went yesterday rather than to go through 200, which is somewhat difficult to read sometimes, to answer or help, answer that question for my friend at the HUD office. So that's what we need to do. That, I would definitely grab that one so you can get your hands on it if you need it later on. Okay. It's a little bit lengthy, but just download it and stick it on a thumb drive, so, procurement checklist, that's going to be helpful. All of these are helpful, things. Total development costs for NAHASDA, keep that one in mind. That's something you might want to keep on that thumb drive because you got to make sure that you're following that also. So there's good ones in here, but there's some that you really need to pay attention to. Okay, so on with the non-competitive methods. Okay, so that is also under 200, 320C, a non-competitive proposal when you can only get your item from a single source. Okay, now that's really difficult. There should always be more than one vendor for whatever you procure. If you have something more specific than that, you probably shouldn't have that product. Okay. Now, a public exigency or an emergency requirement that will not permit a delay resulting from a competitive selection. Okay. That's the other time that you can use that. Maybe where I'm at, up in the Upper Peninsula in that rural, description. If the heater breaks and it's going to be down for a couple of days and it's really cold, it could cost, all the water lines to play, plus you've got all your tenants, that you have to take care of. That way they might actually authorize something like that. And in that case, you hope it doesn't happen on a Friday night, Saturday, or a Sunday, because you're supposed to be getting permission from your federal agent's entity, okay, in response to a written request. You always call them up in the panic first. Who do I put this into? What do I do? And that's what I always did, and then would follow it up with that written one. Or after a solicitation of a number of sources, your competition is determined inadequate. So I came across this situation. Going back in time, probably now at least 10 years, we didn't have a lot of methamphetamine use because of, certain things that we no gang activity, things like that. We utilize a lot of the NAHASDA, allowance for law enforcement agencies, and we have fair market houses, which are nice, and we actually encourage law enforcement from 20 miles away will come out. We have several of them that are still tenants. So you go around one of my larger 80-unit projects and you would hit one corner and there'd be a sheriff's car. And you go around the next one and there's a state police vehicle. And then you'll see a tribal vehicle and you'll see, wildlife. It puts a presence there, and it actually will deter crime. So we didn't have a lot of activity. Well, somebody came up and their parents, one of them had passed away in a mutual help unit, and they were smoking methamphetamine. Now, in the middle of the winter, okay, inside, around a heater area where it's going to get sucked through that ventilation system and have the ability to penetrate, walls, drywall, carpet, all of that. Now, we have to turn that unit over to another family. And the family that was slated for it also had a baby. But regardless, you would have taken the same steps, okay? So we needed to get the unit tested for methamphetamine, which in the Upper Peninsula at that time was not done. Maybe 4 or 5 hours away on the other side, or down into the Lower Peninsula 4 or 5 hours from there. But at that point, there was really not a lot of testing. So you're thinking, well, you can get a test on Amazon. Well, the way that we had written it, and we had worked, with the HUD office, that if they were going to find something, we were also going to award the remediation of that, the immediate remediation. And you probably I should have broken up both bits, okay? But they still might have not answered it just to do the testing. So I couldn't get, the first time out, I got nobody. Put it out for bid again, wider area, got one. It's like, that's not really sufficient. Do it again. So this house sat with, the big, basically, sign on the door saying that it's condemned at this point with yellow caution tape, and nobody was allowed in it, including my maintenance men, because, they don't know exposure. And I was aware of what took place. When you're aware of things, you have to treat it a lot differently, and protect my staff also. So at that point, we did it again, so we're months into the situation, and they allowed me to take that sole source after I put it out for bid the third time, because there wasn't really enough profit guaranteed for somebody to mobilize and then do the remediation if it was needed, and from such a distance. So that does happen once in a while, okay? But you got to have HUD's permission in writing, and you have to put it in writing to them, but you call them up. It's the first thing you do. So that non-competitive method can be used only in extraordinary situations, often requires special approval from HUD, pretty much always does, depending if you've only got one. Only when other methods are infeasible, must document your reason for use. So I have been into a couple of places where I've heard the maintenance guys, or the head positions say, well, we tell them that we can't. No, they're not going to buy that, and you're going to get a finding. And sure enough, I'll go back a year later, 6 months later, and if HUD's been there, they get a finding, or their auditor will find them under this. It's just not liked, so you take all those steps first and try to get those bids. So under that 320C, under very, certain very limited circumstances, your procurements at 10,000 or more can be made without soliciting quotes. They include a sole source. That item is available only from a single source. For example, a repair of a computer can only be done perhaps by that particular manufacturer. The emergency, if the situation poses an immediate threat to the health or safety of your resident, or an immediate threat to your building structure. That's what I was explaining about, a heating system during cold conditions, broken water pipes. So your emergency wouldn't allow or permit that delay resulting from a competitive solicitation. The federal awarding agency or pass-through entity expressly authorizes non-competitive proposals in response to a written request from your non-federal entity. Or you have inadequate competition. After solicitation of a number of prices, quotes, or bids, your competition is determined inadequate. And that's basically, I fell under that one. So you have to make sure you document. Negotiate with the single source, provide preferences when feasible, and you need to do a cost analysis. What they're proposing, is that reasonable? Your HUD approval, what are they going to want when that approval is required? They're going to want your cost analysis. They may request to see all your procurement materials prior to the award of a contract. Show me where you publicized and tried to get somebody else. Written reasons why that award cannot be made through competition. So that's pretty much all I can tell you about that activity. Is if you're going to do it, you proceed with extreme caution, because in most cases it's going to get you a finding unless you have permission. Okay. So your quotation evaluations, price reasonableness. Before making an award, your contracting officer is supposed to determine that proposed price is reasonable. For most small purchases, price analysis is sufficient to make that determination. In cases where your TDHE purchases services, items of a non-commercial nature, a special training course designed for your employees, maybe a consultant brought on to go, with your housing board through all of your policies to hash through them and see if they need updating, Submission of cost details, cost analysis could be needed. So micro purchases, your price analysis normally consists of comparing your quoted prices to the prices recently paid for the same or similar items, price lists, catalogs, internet. The signature of your contracting officer on that purchase order or contract signifies your contracting officer's determination that they deem that price reasonable based on either prior purchases of that similar nature or your sources of information where you've compared it to. Now, I can compare an item through one of those big box stores and compare it to one of my smaller ones in my area, and there's always going to be a price difference. You have to look at how much the mobilization, the gas, to go get these things, or the shipping it would cost to, to have them sent up would cost. And if that still, makes it reasonable. Okay. So your other small purchases above your micro purchase level. So your price analysis will consist of a comparison of quotations to each other and to other sources of pricing information, past pricing, catalog, internet, newspaper ads. If only one response is received, your contracting officer should include a statement of reasonableness in your contract file. That statement can be based on market research, comparison of the proposed price, with prices found reasonable on your previous purchases, current list, catalogs, everything that I just went through, advertisements. So that comparison with similar items in a related industry sometimes is going to involve that contracting officer's personal knowledge at the time of the purchase, in the comparison in that ice or any other reasonable basis. Why do you find this, adequate? Only in rare cases would your contracting officer conduct a cost analysis, which is, for a non-commercial type purchase, unique to your TDHE's needs, such as the trading course for your accounting personnel. Ooh, I might have went to. So your other factors, if you're using price and other factors to determine an award, your contracting officer has a broad discretion in fashioning your evaluation procedures. So your contracting officer should make sure their quotations are evaluated in an efficient and minimally burdensome manner. Your competitive proposal type, formal evaluations, determining competitive ranges, conducting detailed negotiations, requesting best and final offers should not be used for your small purchases. Contracting officers can use information such as their knowledge of and previous experience with that particular supply or service item that you're purchasing, and the vendor's past performance with your TDHE, or customer surveys to evaluate that quotation. So evaluating contractor responsibility. Your housing entity has to make awards only to, remember, responsible and responsive contractors, possessing that ability to perform successfully under your terms and conditions of your proposed procurement. For small purchasing, where payment is generally made only after full delivery and the completion of a job, always keep retainage, guys. The contracting officer has a broad latitude in evaluating contractor responsibility, including, your contractor's personal knowledge of or past experience with the vendor. So the signature of your contracting officer on your purchase order or that contract signifies your contractor's basic determination that responsibility is they find satisfactory. So documentation, your TDHE has to maintain those records in sufficient detail to signify the whole history, of that particular procurement action. That documentation is important in case somebody lodges a protest against your TDHE. It's also going to facilitate for, your future purchases. Nope, this is what we paid. This is reasonable. It's right in the same, realm. So it'll facilitate for future purchases of similar supplies or services, because then it won't be necessary to recreate those solicitation documents also. So you always want to keep all that stuff, but you need that history of why you have spent those federal funds. So your supporting documentation shall be in writing, placed in your procurement file. Got to be able to read it. You got to be able to find it. Okay. Those records shall include, but shall not necessarily be limited to, the following: rationale for the method of your procurement selected. For example, your contract file would not need to state why the contracting officer chose a small purchase procedure to order a desk, but would want to know why a non-competitive proposal was used for perhaps a roofing contract. You need to keep the solicitation, the selection of the contract pricing arrangement, but only if not apparent. For example, the contract price or file, would not need to document why a firm fixed price was used to obtain building material. It tells you not to overdo your paperwork, basically. But I would always err in the side of caution. If I thought it needed to be documented, I was going to document it, and I was going to want it in that file. That's just the way I am, So for your documentation of micro purchases, if it's a competitive quotation, if they're solicited, that award is made to somebody other than your low quote, you need documentation to support that purchase. It could be limited to identification of your solicited vendors and a brief explanation of why you made that award decision that particular way. So documentation, they say, should be kept to a minimum. You should retain the information supporting your purchases, your paper or electronic, to the minimum extent and duration needed for management review purposes, tracking purchasing activity, and the following is going to illustrate the extent to which quotation information should be recorded. Oral solicitations, your contracting officer should establish and maintain records of oral price quotations sufficient to reflect clearly the propriety of placing that order and the price you paid with that particular vendor. In most cases, this effort is going to consist merely of showing the names of the vendors contacted and the prices and other terms and conditions quoted by each. You need who you talked to and the date also on there, and the time. I used to note the time. So written solicitations, limit written records of solicitations or offers to notes or abstracts that show prices, delivery, references to printed price list used, your vendor contacted, and other pertinent information. And then your special situations include additional statements explaining the absence of competition if only one source is solicited, and supporting the award decision if other than the price related factor was considered in selecting the vendor. Okay, we wanted 150 pieces of drywall and a piece of equipment, and this guy was lower in price, but he couldn't get it for 45 days. This guy was slightly higher, but we could have it within the week. You go with the guy, you're going to get it within the week if you need it, but you need to, why did you do that? Well, this was the reason, the delivery time or the availability. So your method of solicitation, quotations for small purchases can be obtained, remember, writing, hard copy, email, orally, fax, catalogs, letters, electronic means, the internet, paid advertisements, displaying the solicitation in a public place. Your methods should be appropriate to the purchase. Obtaining price quotes by phone for commercially available supply items. TDHEs can establish in their procurement policies dollar thresholds or other requirements for the use of your written and oral solicitations. Written solicitations are used when it's necessary to provide your vendors with detailed information. Things that cannot be conveyed orally, by phone, or with detailed quotation evaluation information. Your contracting officer should determine your best method given that situation. So when it gets to suspension and debarment, okay, first of all, the suspension is a temporary, okay, measure. There's a 12-month limit. Usually, dependent, it's pending the completion of that investigation or the legal proceeding based upon adequate evidence, usually an indictment. Debarment is usually 3 years in length, based upon a preponderance of the evidence, usually a conviction. In accordance with 24 CFR 1044, in addition to any tribal requirements, the prohibitions described at 2 CFR 2424 on the use of debarred, suspended, or ineligible contractors apply. So this is even in my tribal procurement policy. It was in our housing one and it was in the tribal one. We had two separate. But this is a requirement under the use of those federal funds under 2 CFR 200. So they had to adhere to the same rules. So your debarment, that exclusion from participation in all federally funded programs. So they have to check when I go to work if I am debarred or suspended every single time I get a contract with somebody, okay? Because they're paying me with federal funds. So your debarment, that exclusion from participation in all federal funded program for a reasonable specified period of time, commensurate upon the seriousness of the violation or failure to perform on other contracts. It's there to protect you, okay, and to protect those federal funds. Such action is taken pending the elimination of the circumstances for which that debarment was imposed. It can be imposed for a violation of contract clauses, including equal opportunity provisions, acceptance of contingency fees or contingent fees, any of the Secretary of Labor, okay, not paying Davis-Bacon, taking unnecessarily, paycheck deductions, not paying them overtime. Those will all get you one. Or other serious contract violations. The Secretary of Labor may, independently of HUD, debar a firm based on violations of labor standards. And I have seen that happen. And you don't want to deal with the contractor that's known for doing that because you might be the next victim. Okay. This is really important. Like right now I'm sitting in Florida, and after all the storms that they have, that's all you see on the news is these people getting taken for thousands and thousands of their, money for people that were supposed to be fixing their houses or doing their roofs or whatever. They don't know to check for debarment. They don't know to check for the Better Bureau or Business Bureau, things like that. And these companies come in and ask for money up front and rip them off. We have to make sure that we're protecting those dollars, and that does not happen. So you can't say, yeah, I checked to see if he was debarred. You need to be able to prove that. Take a screenshot, take a picture and print it, but you have to be able to prove that you checked your vendors. And that means all of your vendors. Your heating and cooling guys, and you should be checking them at least once a year, maybe every 6 months, those people that you use. So suspension means a disqualification from all federally assisted programs for a temporary period of time because of adequate evidence that the firm engaged in criminal, fraudulent, seriously improper conduct. Okay? Improper conduct. So your contractor is suspended pending that investigation and the appropriate action by, whatever part of the federal government. All suspensions are for a temporary period pending the completion of that investigation and the legal proceedings as they may ensue. So where do you go? You go to SAM. What is SAM? SAM is the System for Award Management. It's a federal government-owned and operated free website, consolidates the capabilities in the central contractor registration, FedReg Online, representation, certification applications, ORCA, excluded party systems. That's what you're looking for, EPLS. You also get your wage decisions here. So you need to become familiar with SAM. And the good thing about SAM is you can get on YouTube. For those of you, if you don't know how to do something, get on YouTube, and look. A lot of times they'll walk you right through it, but they have that on there. I've had people, that's how they learned. So you identify your excluded firms. So your exclusions area within your performance information functional area of SAM, the Systems for Award Management, used to be formerly the Excluded Parties List, EPLS. They identify parties excluded from receiving federal contracts, certain subcontracts, certain types of federal financial and non-financial assistance and benefits. As exclusion records are publicly available, SAM keeps the user community aware of administrative statutory exclusions across the entire federal government, or the entire government, I shouldn't say federal, and individuals barred from entering the United States. So the more commonly used term of suspensions and debarments will reflect exclusions. So the following information is taken from the SAM's Exclusions Extract User Guide. They try to walk you through how do you check to see if that entity is excluded from receiving federal awards. Use the following steps to see if the entity is subject to any active exclusions, suspensions, debarments imposed by a federal agency. You go to http.sam.gov. On the home page or the search records tab, type the entity's name or their DUNS number in the search. You can be asking for that in their contracting information. Important note, individuals are not assigned DUNS numbers. If you're checking for an exclusion of an individual, you search by typing in their name, okay? If no exclusion record is found by the entity does not have an active exclusion submitted in SAM by a federal agency. If the exclusion record is found, it's going to display in a box marked exclusion in purple. Check the status in the top right corner of the box. If the status indicates active, you have an active exclusion for that particular entity. So just seeing that that entity has an active exclusion is not sufficient. As an awarding official, you must continue for the next steps. If you're reviewing an exclusion record as indicated by that purple box exclusion in the upper left corner of the search result, click View Details to open the exclusion record and see your additional information. If you're viewing an entity management record as indicated in a green box marked Entity in your upper left corner of the search result, click View Details to view the entity's dashboard for more information. Use the navigation links on the left side of the screen to review the entity's exclusion. Click on the Active Exclusions link to view all the current exclusions. Click on the View Exclusion to view the data in the specific exclusion record. Scroll through the exclusion record to review those details. For more information, refer to the System for Award Management, SAM, at www.sam.gov, and also there's YouTube videos. So we are all supposed to, under the NAHASDA statute, give native preference, okay? In accordance, so you'd go to section 101 of the NAHASDA statute, go to K. A recipient shall apply the tribal employment and contract preference laws, including regulations and tribal ordinances adopted by the tribe that receives the benefits from the funds granted to the recipient under NAHASDA. Okay, so almost every one of our tribes has this. We're going to hire Bay Mills members first, and then whatever order they go. A non-Bay Mills member with Bay Mills children, or married to a Bay Mills member with, children, or and then any other native. But they have a rating and a ranking for our native preferences. Almost all of our tribes do. If you can get a copy of yours, okay, they've probably been there for 15, 20, 25 years, probably in their personnel policies also. If not through your human resource department, put those in with your documents. It'll, save your HUD officials and your auditors from looking for them also, but keep them with your policies. In the absence of a tribal employment and contract preference law, a recipient must, to the greatest extent feasible, give preference in the award of contracts for projects funded under this part to Indian organizations, Indian-owned economic enterprises, in accordance with Section 7B of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, 25 U.S.C. 450EB. Usually those native preference laws apply to the tribal members in hiring, and the opposite way in layoff. The Bay Mills, will be the last to be laid off, in that situation. So they'll oftentimes go both ways. So Section 7B provides any contract, subcontract, grant, subgrant entered into for the benefit of a Native American or an Alaska Native shall require, to the greatest extent feasible, preferences and opportunities for training and employment in connection with the administration of such contracts or subcontracts be given to Native Americans and Alaska Natives. Hey, if you're building a big project, talk to your contractor when you're getting ready to hire them and say, hey, we would like to see you use some of our tribal members. We can give you a list. How can we make that happen? The idea is to get as many of your people employed as possible. Get some, trained, certified carpenters out of the deal. Oftentimes they're willing to do that for you. And they're supposed to do that for you. Preference in the award of contracts, subcontracts in connection with the administration of contracts be given to Indian organizations, Native-owned economic enterprises, as defined within Section 3 of the Indian Financing Act of 1974. So Indian preference has to be applied to all purchases made with IHBG funds. Doesn't require that all purchases be made from Native-owned firms. It only means there must be a system in place for giving that preference. The following are the applicable regulations for implementing preferences. Okay, so the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975 authorizes the Secretary of the Interior, Health, Education, Welfare, and other government entities or agencies to enter into contracts with and make grants directly to federally recognized Indian tribes. The tribes would have the authority for how they're going to administer their funds, which gave them greater control over their welfare. Preference in the award of subcontracts and subgrants in connection with the administration of those contracts or grants shall be given to Indian organizations, Indian-owned economic enterprises, as defined within Section 3 of the Indian Financing Act of 1974. So the final rule was amended. You can read about that at 1048, 1050, and 1052 to provide for tribal preference in employment and contracting. There is also a guidance document all the way back to 2013. It is in your reference materials. You need to adhere to the Indian preference requirements. And if you have tarot officers, that's what they're supposed to be doing. It becomes interesting when you work with them. So that's the program guidance to provide additional information on administering those revisions. So we have a caveat that I alluded to in earlier training. Part 200 of the regulations apply in connection with any federally funded project. NAHASDA procurement differs from Part 200 in a few respects, including providing for tribal preferences. The tribe's name. Bay Mills Indian community preference to supersede Indian preference, permitting tribal prevailing wage determinations. Remember, I told you that you can do that. It's not a one and done. It documents how to do that in the reference materials, should your governing body decide that they want to do that, but it only applies to NAHASDA funded projects, okay? Permitting alternates, basically, to your construction bonds, The Part 200 regulations provide program-specific regulations. The NAHASDA regulations trump the Part 200 regulations, and you list your name, and the preference applies only to construction projects funded under NAHASDA or the Self-Determination Act. Okay. So your tribal action, they would pass and adopt a law, a code, or regulations regarding tribal preference if they decide that they want to offer that. They adopt the policies, the personnel, the procurement regarding the preference. Such law or policy can provide preferential treatment over other Indians that are not members of your tribe in employment and contracting, and in reductions in workforce and layoff. So under 1052 and 101K of NAHASDA, the recipient shall apply your tribal employment contract preference laws, including regulations and tribal ordinances adopted by the Indian tribe that receives the benefits from the funds granted through NAHASDA. In the absence of that tribal employment and contract preference law, you as a recipient must, to the greatest extent feasible, give preference to the award of your projects funded under that part to Indian organizations and Indian-owned economic enterprises in accordance with Section 7B. Okay. So to implement your Indian preference requirements, you have to certify you have policies and procedures in place. You can go to 1052 to read about that. You have to have preference clauses incorporated into your contracts. You include Indian preference references in your notices and your advertisements. So it's real. That's one of the reasons, if you're not used to doing a lot of things like that and it's a bigger project, you're better off getting an engineer or an architect and an engineer to help with this portion to make sure that you draft all those requirements that are necessary to make sure that you cover them, because you not only have to cover the Indian preference, you have to cover the Davis-Bacon, and making sure those languages are put out right from the get-go so that they know they have to include that, because they're going to up the amount of the bids because of those requirements. I hate to say that, but that's what happens. So that importance of Indian preference, it provides special opportunities for Indian contractors in selection. It mandates additional preferences that contractors must offer Indian laborers, subcontractors, and suppliers. It offers your economic opportunities for your Indians, tribes, recipients, and your community, but you are not required to hire an Indian individual or firm. You also have to remember responsive and responsible. Now, I went through and gave one of our tribal contractors, a chance on a couple of small units, and they held up all my other tradespeople. They just did not perform in a timely manner, and it resulted in costing more money to build those units. So then I built a slightly larger, a couple more units, and give them one additional chance and told them right from the get-go, if you're late, this is going to be the last time. I'm not going to be able to award you this preference again. Documented, and documented again. Okay. Kept the tribal council advised. And unfortunately, the same thing happened, and it ended up costing, lots of money, because our contractors, when you build like that, you plan on one person doing something, getting out of there, the next person coming in their place, finishing there, and everything goes like that. And if one stops you, oftentimes you're going to pay for it all the way down the road in time, materials, money, So I was there a long time, 28 years. And they had that firm for 28 years. And every single time a new tribal council would come through, they'd go in there and say, that Cheryl won't give me any jobs, and I'm from this reservation. I should be the first one that's hired. And I would haul out all the documentation and say, hey, I am hired to do the best for you, get the most out of these federal funds. I'm not allowed, just because he is a native from this tribe, to hire somebody that is not responsible or responsive. I cannot deem them that way. And they would see my way, but I would have to go through that often. That's why it was so important that you document also. So you might come across that, especially, on your tribes. And sometimes you're going to be put in a position where you have somebody that is capable of doing the work, but then you're building in a higher number where they might not have the labor force or the materials or the money or the tools, to take something of that magnitude either. And you have to tell them no. But it just puts you in an awkward situation, but you have to make sure that you cross your T's, dot your I's, and document it. So your preference in your solicitation process, it's required by federal and oftentimes your tribal law. You clarify all your preference standards in your procurement policy. You clarify those preference standards from the outset in everything you advertise, every contact you put out there. You have to be, Davis Bacon and Indian preference. Those are your two main things that you're, have to be aware that you put in there. Indian preference is different from other preferences. It is not racially or affirmative action based. It's the political status of us as a recipient, as a tribe and a tribal member. And it arises from a different part of federal law, okay? Sometimes you need to explain that. I explain that in, several of my classes, why we don't have to follow certain laws. And you'll often hear, they can't do that. That's discrimination. That's against, the Fair Housing Act, or that's, no. We are appropriated that money from Congress for the benefit of low-income Native Americans. Ours is totally different. So where that Indian preference is applied, it's applied in the selection of your contractors, of your vendors, in the contractor selection of their subcontractors and their suppliers. It goes all the way down. And during employment and training by contractors. You need to qualify them for Indian preference, okay? Specifically determines if the individual and those entities are qualified to receive Indian preference. You don't rely on the determination of someone else. And you can change that, if you should get new information. So you don't rely on determinations and certifications of others. Who's eligible for Indian preference? Okay. This part took me a while to learn. And I checked every piece of the law that I could find. And then I turned to my people at HUD, my beeps. Can you tell me this? And then they went to the NAHASDA definition and different things like that. Eligible for Indian preference does not apply to a state recognized tribe. It's a member of a federally recognized tribe for Indian preference under NAHASDA. The entities have to be at least 51% owned and controlled by such, members or tribes. They can't be a front, okay? And you have every right, if they are asking for Indian preference, to make them prove that. They can't be just a figurehead, okay? 51% ownership and control. They should be able to be on the bank accounts, be writing, the checks, all of that. Control includes voting rights, management, decision-making, allocation of profits. If the entity is owned by a tribe or a tribal member, you have to show that it's 51% membership and control. That preference, they have to request Indian preference, okay? You advise all your bidders, all your proposers, your vendors. Indian preference is required in your contract awards. Parties seeking preference must request preference. When feasible, you provide your interested parties with an Indian preference qualification application. So you need an application. And you need a letter deeming them eligible or ineligible, because you have to let them know. There's various ways to determine eligibility. Approaches based on the size, the regularity, the nature of your procurement. The more thorough the process, the better. on large procurements, make those determinations prior to the submission of the bid or proposal. You could pre-qualify your Native American firms, your Indian firms. Shall include a determination that the bidder is a responsible contractor. Okay. Yeah, they could be Native, but we have to still deem you responsive and responsible. You should have all of these documents in your portfolio of your procurement. Okay. Indian preference policy, your Indian preference qualification application. Remember, they got to apply for it. Your Indian preference determination letter. Now you have to deem, if they're qualified or not qualified. And then you need a complaints policy. From methods of providing for Indian preference. And do not try to shorten the timeline on that. The complaints policy is basically in the regs. And they subscribe to a certain amount of days. And so I'm doing policy for somebody and I'm thinking, I don't think that's numbers right. So I shoot it to somebody at HUD and they're like, absolutely not. You cannot shorten the days allowed for within that, so you have to use the regs basically to write that particular policy. So there's your Indian preference policy. Your qualification application, the following applicant seeks to qualify as a 51% or more Indian-owned and controlled and tribal organization, so it can be eligible for Indian preference, with the Bay Mills Housing Authority. The selection and award of the contract, subcontracts, employment, and training. The application must be submitted in a timely manner and by the date prescribed by ATIHA, the Any Tribal Indian Housing Authority. In order for the applicant to be considered eligible for Indian preference, the applicant may be required to periodically resubmit this application from time to time. Want to make sure that nothing changes. That structure does not change. Okay. So this is the one you're going to send back to them. And in your policy, it should also tell you how long you have to return this. Okay. Dear who? Any Tribal Indian Housing Authority has made the following general contracting pre-qualification determination for the WHO organization and has asked me to communicate this decision to you. Pre-qualification would entitle you to Indian preference in our bid letting and the award of general construction contracts on projects for ATIHA. In order to qualify for this preference, the TDHE had to determine that you satisfied each of its Indian preference requirements. The standards require that you be Indian-owned firm, an Indian-controlled firm, a firm with a general financial and managerial capability to do the work, that you need to be reputable, a responsible firm, and that you have timely submitted a properly completed pre-qualification application. So therefore, you are either qualified or disqualified, but you should have that letter. And then that complaint procedure, okay? It's 20 calendar days. I think they tried to shorten it to 14. So that is under 1054. You can get it word for word for there, but you need to have a preference, Indian preference complaint procedure in your procedures, okay? You have to have an Indian preference complaint procedure, sort of like a grievance. You need a grievance procedure for your tenants. You need a grievance procedure for your staff. So you need 3 of them, basically. So each complaint shall be in writing, signed, filed with recipient, filed with the recipient no later than 20 calendar days from the date of the action or omission for which the complaint is based. And when feasible, use your Indian preference qualification application, require supporting documentation. Establish that panel of 3 staff or board members. Remember where I was saying it really, really helps to have those people that are, and they just basically focus on procurement and construction in those areas. So the same 3 people that you're using, those same decision makers, will do that evaluation. and you make that independent verification and inquiry. Common fronting practices disguise how little profit that tribe or tribal member actually gets. Indian tribe or member appears on paper as 51% owner, but management control are with the non-Indian portion of the firm. Less than truthful in explaining resources that each owner brings to the entity. As always, document, document, document. You carefully record your decision in writing. Make that brief decision in writing. Be prepared to provide further explanation of anybody that you disqualify. Explain to any disqualified party they can still submit a bid or proposal. You are just not giving them or granting them Indian preference. Reserve the right to reconsider. Okay, that should be also in your paperwork. Reserve the right to disqualify anyone, even if you've already qualified them, right up until the award of your contract. In that case, you become aware of new information or that entity structure changes. You can add contract provisions for termination if the entity loses its Indian ownership or control during your contract period. So applying Indian preference 1052A, you certify as the TDHE that you have a policy that will afford Indian preference consistent with the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. You can solicit bids from Indian owned and controlled entities only, or you can also use a two-stage method. So a two-stage method, you solicit statements of intent from Indian owned and controlled entities. If you have two or more received from qualified entities, you can solicit bids and proposals from Indian owned and controlled entities only. Otherwise, you can solicit bids and proposals from all entities using whatever your established method for applying that Indian preference is. If any method of Indian preference results only in one bid or proposal being received, then you need to re-advertise it. Using any approved method of Indian preference under A, you can re-advertise it to all entities using maybe the X factor or other points for preference, or you can ask EWONAP for approval. It has to be justified in writing, remember. So this is what the X factor is for Indian preference. It's an optional method utilizing or implementing the native preference requirements found at 24 CFR 1052, so you can read more about them there. Under this method, the award shall be made under an unrestricted solicitation to the lowest responsive bidder from a qualified Indian-owned economic enterprise or organization with the maximum total contract price established for the specific project or activity being solicited. If the bid is no more than X higher than the total bid price of the lowest responsive bid from any qualified bidder. The X factor is determined as follows, and then it shows you all the way down. Okay, the next section. Half hour to go, guys. Procurement principles and standards. Under 1042 are the requirements of Section 3 of the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968 applicable. Because everything we have, and depending on what type of guidance you're looking at, the age of the guidance, even part of the Indian preference, will refer to Section 3 sometimes, okay? So Section 3 of the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968, no, recipients shall comply with the Indian preference requirements of Section 7 of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act, 25 U.S.C. 5307B, or employment and contract preference laws adopted by the recipient's tribe in accordance with 101 of NAHASDA. Okay, so we used to see Section 3 requirements back in time, and some of those guidance documents have not been updated yet, and they'll refer to this. Okay, so Your auditor selection. You need to procure your auditor. In procuring your audit services, you have to follow the following procurement standards prescribed by the procurement standards at 200-317 through 327. When you are requesting proposals for audit services, the objectives and scope of the audit must be made clear. The non-federal entity must request a copy of the audit organization's peer review report. Okay. I can't remember when this became a requirement. I'm saying within the last 10 years, maybe only 5, I don't know, but it's, not too relatively long ago. And we still have a lot of tribes that fail to ask for that peer review report, but it is a requirement. So you got to make sure you do that. Which the auditor is required to provide under GAGAS. So factors to be considered in evaluating each proposal for your audit services include the responsiveness to your request for proposal, relevant experience, availability of staff, professional qualifications, technical abilities, the results of your peer and external quality control reviews, and price. Also ask for how many times they've worked with an Indian housing entity, okay? It's really hard. I did it, I think, only once. And I was on the phone with my HUD office all the time because they kept trying to give me public housing rules. Those don't apply. Those don't apply. I'd have to find it. And then if I couldn't find it fast enough, I'd call the HUD office. I was doing it with the administrator after one point, bless his heart, because I was very frustrated like the third day in. Price and cost analysis, your independent cost estimate. So if your proposed price is fair and reasonable prior to awarding a contract, the determination must be made that the proposed price is fair and reasonable. This is accomplished by performing a cost or price analysis prior to the contract award. The type of the analysis will vary depending upon the method of procurement and the estimated dollar value of that contract. The definitions used there: cost refers to how much the contractor will have to pay to perform the contract. Price refers to how much the contractor will charge to perform the contract. Profit is what is left over after the contractor has paid all of its cost. Price analysis is the most common technique for evaluating the price of a procurement. Price analysis is a review and evaluation of a proposed price without evaluating separate cost elements. Cost analysis is a review and evaluation of the separate elements of the cost that make up the contractor's cost proposal. Cost plus profit equal the price. So how your cost price analysis applies in different procurement methods for a small purchase. When using a small purchase method of procurement, price analysis is conducted by obtaining price or rate quotes from an adequate number of qualified sources, comparing the quotes or rates to prior purchases of a similar nature. These situations are typical of many procurements and do not require a more formal analysis. Sealed bidding. Purchasing of supplies, equipment, and construction are typically accomplished using sealed bidding. Sealed bidding is mandatory for the procurement of equipment, supplies, services, or construction that exceeds $250,000. The reasonableness of the price is established by comparison of an independent cost estimate, an ICE, and your competitive bids that you receive. No further price analysis is required. However, cost analysis is required in certain situations when only one bid is received. That one bid will get you in trouble every time. It causes different things to trigger. So your competitive proposal is most often used when acquiring your professional consultants, architects, engineers, A&E services. In order to determine the reasonableness of cost under these types of contracts, your contracting officer will need to ask the offerers to submit the elements of their cost, i.e. a cost breakdown. As such, your contracting officer should perform a cost analysis and will need to apply cost principles. For a non-competitive proposal, if the procurement is by non-competitive proposal has been justified under one of the circumstances found at 200-320, no cost analysis is required for the effort of trying to determine cost reasonableness. According to 200-320, procurement by non-competitive proposals is procurement through solicitation of a proposal from only one source and may be used only when one or more of the following circumstances apply. And we all know those. Only available from one single source, public emergency or exigency for the requirement will not permit a delay resulting from your competitive solicitation. Your federal awarding agency or pass-through entity expressly authorizes a non-competitive proposal in response to a written request from you as a non-federal entity, or after solicitation of a number of sources, your competition is deemed inadequate. Price first versus a cost analysis. Your cost analysis is needed when the elements of your cost, your i.e. professional consulting AE service contracts. When non-competitive proposal method, after soliciting and you only get one bid with a determination of inadequate competition or a change order to the contract that would affect the price. Again, I always started out telling them, I do not like change orders. If you change order me, a lot, don't expect to be hired again in the future unless it's my fault somehow. So your price versus cost analysis, those priced analysis used in all other instances to determine reasonableness of that proposed contract price. Your cost analysis techniques, you do an independent cost estimate, do an ICE before receiving your bids or your proposals, verify that pricing, evaluate your cost proposal, including the necessary and reasonableness of those costs, your technical appraisal, by your engineer, application of correct indirect cost rates, direct labor rates, etc., and evaluate fair and reasonable profit. We're not supposed to be making them rich either. So your cost analysis techniques, compare your contractor cost against the actual cost if it's the same contractor. Previous cost estimates from the same firm or other firms or similar items. Techniques to be used to perform the work are cost consistent with, your proposed approach. So under 200-323, you must perform cost and price analysis for sealed bids, competitive proposals, and non-competitive proposal procurement in excess of your simplified acquisition threshold, including contract changes. Method varies with your cost and your factors. Cost analysis is encouraged for your micro and your small purchases. You must at least document what your amount your TDHE considers reasonable. You should start with that ICE before bids or your proposals. Your cost estimates are not disclosed. It's confidential information, okay? But you have to keep that paperwork. So contract cost and price, that cost or price analysis, almost done. The cost or price analysis is required. Cost includes contract amount plus change orders. That's above your simplified acquisition threshold. If you are at or below your simplified acquisition threshold, your cost or price analysis is not required. However, it has to be reasonable and an estimate is necessary to determine if that procurement falls into that category. Reasonable, okay, for your price analysis techniques. You compare proposed prices received in response to your solicitation. You compare past prices, contracts for the same or similar items and services. You apply yardsticks. How much per square foot? How much per pound? How much per unit? To find your differences. Compare your competitive pricing lists, your cost estimating publications, your published market prices, etc. So, your price analysis is essentially price comparison. It's the evaluation of a proposed price, that lump sum, without analyzing any of the separate cost elements it's composed of. A cost analysis is the evaluation of those separate elements, the labor, the materials that make up a contractor's total cost proposal or price for both new contracts and modifications to determine if they're allowable, directly related to the requirement, and ultimately reasonable. Is the cost or price analysis always required? Yes. HUD's regulations require grantees to perform a cost or price analysis for every procurement action, including contract modifications, change orders, using HUD grant funds. When do I perform a price analysis? You use price analysis whenever you're comparing lump sum prices, not cost estimates, received from contractors in a competitive pricing situation when sealed bids are obtained. What qualifies as competition? Generally, competition means 2 or more responsible, not debarred, suspended offers. Okay? They like 3. Come on, couldn't you get more than 2? You'll get to the point where if you work with HUD people long enough, they'll be really brutally honest with you. So I would really like to see more than, 2. Give me 3, competing independently, submitted priced offers that satisfy the grantee's contract requirements. Obviously, the greater number of offers received, the greater the competition, and ideally, the better pricing you're going to receive. So, when do you perform the cost analysis? Cost analysis is used whenever you do not have a price competition. A cost analysis is required when you're using a competitive proposal or negotiated method of contracting. Acquiring professional, consulting, architect, engineer, AE services under your competitive proposal method, your offers are required to submit cost proposals that show their elements, labor, material, overhead, profit of their proposed cost or their price. Negotiating a contract with a sole source is not soliciting competitive bids or offers. When a sole source is appropriate and justified, you still need to obtain a complete cost breakdown from that sole source contractor. Perform your analysis using your cost principles to establish a fair and reasonable price or estimated cost. After soliciting your competitive sealed bids, you receive only one bid, and it differs substantially from your independent cost estimate or, of that contract price. You need to determine that the bid is unreasonable. You would decide not to recompete. The market survey tells you that you would not get any competition. Then you can formally cancel the solicitation and negotiate a contract price with the single bidder. I tell you right now, if you get to this point, you get HUD on the phone and you get their permission to be doing that, or somebody within your tribe higher up. Okay? Cover your 6. Maybe get your lawyer involved. In that case, you have to obtain a cost breakdown of that single bid price and use cost principles after soliciting competitive sealed bids. Okay, just be careful. Negotiating a modification, including change orders, to any type of a contract, if that modification changes the work authorized under your contract and changes the price or total estimated cost either upwards or downwards, you need to obtain a detailed breakdown of that contractor's proposed cost, not a lump sum proposal, before negotiating that change in that contract price. Caution: modifications that change the work beyond the scope of the contract have to be justified. If the out-of-scope change cannot be justified, you have to procure that work competitively. That's why I said, if you're new to doing anything like that, you definitely call in, one of your big dogs. Useful life. How is it related to your affordability? Okay. So this is the guidance. There's two of them. I utilized both of them when I was writing my policy, when we were working with this stuff. The prior document is 2014-09 program guidance. It's got some samples in it that aren't here. This one's got something for FHA loans, okay? That was not in the first guidance. The intent of the guidance is to give you as a recipient information about maintaining your block grant housing, assisted housing, non-housing projects for the useful life of the property, okay? They give you the money for the purposes of helping low-income Native Americans. Is what this boils down to, okay? And helping as many as you can with that amount of money for the longest period of time. Okay. It's going to clarify what is considered satisfactory to the secretary. Now, depending on the class that I'm teaching, I will oftentimes, when it means satisfactory to the secretary, the majority of the time that you deem that is through your Indian Housing Plan or your APR. If they approve that, it's deemed satisfactory through the secretary. Okay. So what constitutes an acceptable binding commitment? And the program guidance has been updated to include an FHA loan rider to NAHASDA, and it replaces program guidance 2014-09. The background goes back to section 205 of the NAHASDA statute, requires housing units remain affordable for either the remaining useful life or of the property as determined by the secretary, or for such other period that the secretary determines is the longest feasible period of time consistent with sound economics and the purposes of NAHASDA. Useful life is the time period during which an assisted property has to remain affordable. NAHASDA gives the secretary the authority to determine your housing unit's useful life or other period of time during which that unit has to remain affordable. The regulation at 1142 states, to the extent required in your Indian Housing Plan, each block grant recipient shall describe your determination of the useful life of assisted housing units in their developments in accordance with your local conditions of the Indian area of the recipient. By finding the IHP to be in compliance with the statute, the department would be determining the useful life in accordance with NAHASDA. So I go in and I work with a lot of housing authorities, either rewriting policy, checking the policies, making sure they're NAHASDA compliant, or I go in, prepare them, for HUD monitoring, or sometimes HUD will send me in after a HUD monitoring, okay? And several times I will ask about their useful life policy, and I'll get this look often from the director, and well, we don't have one. Well, what do you describe to the secretary? Well, we don't. Can I see your Indian Housing Plan? And it's in there, and they don't even know the purpose of it. Okay? It's really important, you guys, pay attention to the useful life requirements. So your NAHASDA statute, your regulations require the affordability period be secured through a binding commitment satisfactory to the secretary. Purpose and the intent of that binding commitment is to guarantee that housing is going to remain affordable for its useful life or affordability period. Your binding commitment requirement under NAHASDA not only applies to the parties, okay, whoever you're going to give the money to, or the house to, or the rehab to, but it applies to the property that is situated on. The purpose and the intent of requiring a binding commitment is to guarantee that housing is going to remain affordable for its useful life, regardless of who may have entered into that contractual agreement or who could be in possession of that property, or, now your binding commitment required cannot be satisfied solely with the contract between the parties. Pursuant to 24 CFR 1144, in order for it to be satisfactory to HUD, a written use restriction that is placed on the property must run with the land, hence a binding commitment must be recorded. So pretty much anything you're going to see in a second over a 5-year period is going to require, you're going to have a written contract with these recipients. You're going to have to track that property. You're going to have to make a couple of decisions about the repayment of those funds. And they're going to have to file either with the BIA or with your land office, your magistrate, whoever it, wherever your county that you're at. Okay. Your affordability period, your first primary objective of NAHASDA stated in Section 201 is to develop, maintain, and operate affordable housing. Occupancy for low-income Native Americans. That's the investment into that community. The return on that investment is the period of continued future use during which that property needs to be available for use by those low-income families. That future use is your affordability period or useful life for that particular property. Housing units constructed, developed, or rehabbed using block grant funds have to establish a useful life to ensure your property is going to remain available to your low-income families. Your housing entity should create a useful life and binding commitment policy and procedure. You're going to need to determine that affordability period, time versus money. Useful life is the time period during which an assisted property has to remain affordable. You are going to have your governing body make a decision. Are you going to require a single recovery amount for repayment if needed? Or are you going to ask for a covenant that requires the full amount of NAHASDA funds invested in that property be refunded in cases of default? Okay. Those are the decisions that you put into the policy. Are you going to implement that prorated amount? If it's a prorated amount, that covenant requires that the amount of NAHASDA funds invested in the property be prorated over the life of the restriction. So if it's a $10,000 10-year period of time, prorated, every year it would go down $1,000. Okay. If it's a single recovery amount, you could be in the 9th year. If it was prorated, you'd owe $1,000 on it. If it was a single recovery amount, you'd owe the whole $10,000. Okay. That's up to you. Most people that I've seen use the prorated amount, not the single recovery. You need the record of the use restriction. Records have to be kept for all the use restrictions, and an acceptable binding commitment in place has to be imposed by a recorded deed restriction, covenants running with the land, or mechanisms approved by HUD. So you need the determination of the affordability period. Okay. The example that they give in, was came from the home program. And this is the one that you'll see most used. I've seen exceptions up in Alaska where it costs more, but not by much. Okay. Most of the time I see this one, and it's in your Indian housing plan. So if you aren't requiring this, go look at your Indian housing plan and see if you have this document in there. And this is the one that came from the home example. So this is the one that you see the majority of the time. Okay. Under 5,000, it's 6 months. So you don't have to record the land restriction. 5,000 to 15,000, 5 years. 15,001 to 40,000, 10 years. Over 40,000, 15 years. New construction, acquisition, and new constructed housing, 20 years. So relatively minor investments, the designated affordability period can be a nominal period of time. NAHASDA requires some period be designated. Additionally, the reasonable affordability period, if it's less than 1 year, the binding commitment is required. It's not necessary to record the written use restriction. Okay. You should be tracking, and there's a sample on here, and it's also in those guidances for self-monitoring that are in your reference materials, samples in there. Okay. The dollar ranges, the corresponding number of years can differ from those shown depending upon your local conditions. Okay. So you can alter that. You can see, you know, lesser amounts or whatever, but HUD has to approve your IHP with that amount in there. I'd be love to know if any of you guys have smaller periods of time in there. So the recipient can choose to assign a longer affordability period if they want to ensure the availability of a larger continuing affordable housing supply for low-income families. I haven't seen that happen yet. So if you choose to use some other method for assigning that affordability period, your IHP should describe how that method provides for the affordability period, appropriate consideration giving to your unique local conditions. When you go to set a useful life, a specific number of years should be given for the affordability period. They don't want to see a range of years, 30 to 40 years, or a general statement. The number of years should be without ambiguous qualification, about or approximate, properly maintained or planned, expected or estimated. Similarly, your designated affordability period should in no way be contingent upon the continuation of block grant funding. So you need to report that useful life, the description of the recipient's plan or system for determining your useful life has to be provided in your IHP yearly. A record of the current specific useful life for your housing units assisted with block grant funds. So basically, if you assist somebody with more than $5,000 in funds for modernization, energy assistance, rehab, building them a house, you need to have all of these in place. And the insurance requirements have a $5,000 threshold also for those same activities. So just become familiar with both of them and make sure you guys have all that, okay? You're the ones that are in charge of that, are hands-on when it comes to those sort of programs, because you're doing the procurement for them usually also. This kind of falls in your realm, okay? Also be aware of the lead-based paint. If you guys are doing rehab, modernization, things like that, and at the age of the unit, if they were built before 78, you got to make sure that there's no lead-based paint there also, okay? So these requirements apply to everything except for your mutual help units built with your 1937 Housing Act funds, okay? Pre-NAHASDA was 1996, or that's when NAHASDA came into effect. Pre-NAHASDA was the 1937 Housing Act. The rentals and the mutual helps and the turnkeys you built, some Section 8, all had the subsidy attached to them, okay? Everything once NAHASDA came into play in 96 has no subsidy. That's the difference between the two. If you guys have rental units where you're getting a subsidy on them, those should be your priorities. Can't keep them vacant. Don't use them as VASH units because you're double dipping that way because the VASH has a subsidy. Always use them as a rental property. Don't use them for non-housing, like a ambulance barn, a laundromat, whatever like that. Don't let them be vacant for more than a year. They're going to check that and you'll have to pay back the money. You'll lose that subsidy and it'll go away forever. If it's a rental property, it's a CAS stock. You will keep those properties forever and they are just invaluable in cost, okay? So those are the rules as far as that goes. Your initial home buyer, any subsequent owner that purchases that property during the period of its useful life need to qualify only at the time of their purchase, okay? They can go up in income, but they have to be income qualified when they move in. In the case of a home owner unit, the new buyer is supposed to qualify at the time of their purchase, but if it's a transfer of a home ownership unit to a family member, and this is a little bit different here, or a household member, a lot of times that wording wasn't in all of our other stuff. If they're listed as a household member, they are not subject to that binding commitment for the remaining use of that life of that property, but you still need to track it, okay? Thus, if that home ownership unit has been transferred to a family member or household member, that written use restriction would not terminate, but it would not apply. And then in case something else happens again with that unit, you're still tracking those years, okay? So any subsequent, like I said, however, any subsequent transfer by the family member or household member to a third party who is not family or household is subject to the remaining useful life or affordability period under that recorded binding commitment. Okay. So you need to collect those monies. And if you don't, HUD will lessen your grant by that amount. They're very picky about that. Okay. That's basically what it says later on here. So these are here for your reading enjoyment. Low income owner occupants of privately owned housing that receive funded assistance, whether it be a loan or a grant, moderate, substantial rehab, have to be low income at the time the assistance, need only be low income at the time the assistance is provided. Have to have the binding commitment accompanying the assistance that guarantees the appropriate useful life or affordability period, provides for remedies for breach of such useful life provisions upon the transfer or ownership during the assigned useful life. That useful life and binding commitment requirements apply to all housing units assisted with those block grant funds, including those developed under the Title VI program. Okay. Model activities, non-housing, it's still going to apply. So you cannot build a pole barn and turn it into a casino. Okay. It's got to have the useful life on that period. Record of use restrictions. Records must be kept for all use restrictions. There's a sample record of use restrictions form with the guidance that can be used by recipients to record both NAHASDA and other affordability or use restrictions. They can vary both in how they're imposed. Model reporting form designated to be the registry of all various use restrictions are placed on recipient properties. So we give down payment assistance. I had a staff member who was married to a non-native. They purchased a house, got the down payment assistance. The house was off of the reservation. They sold the house. She didn't keep it. Her husband didn't keep it. He wasn't native anyway. And the person that purchased it was not native nor low income. They were responsible for paying back the unused portion there of that funding to the housing authority, or she was. Okay, so that's what happens there. You're accepting binding commitment. NAHASDA requires that there be a binding commitment satisfactory to the secretary in place. The written use agreements must also include provisions for useful life and affordability period restrictions as specified in your IHP. Okay. Your written use agreement can contain a schedule outlining a payback of decreasing balance of assistance or that percentage equity over the useful life of that affordability period that would have to be reimbursed to the recipient's program if that subsequent occupant does not meet your eligibility requirements. So you need to tell them that up front before they sign into your programs for assistance, that we have to do this. If you sell it, you're going to have to, and explain what will happen. So there are samples, 6 of them in there. 2 for fee land, 2 for trust land, 1 for model activities, and 1 for FHA insured loans. Okay, so the samples are there. So this is a sample for fee land. When a restriction is paid on fee land, a covenant running with the land is imposed on the property to enforce the restriction. With a single recovery amount, the covenant requires that the full amount of the NAHASDA funds invested in this property be refunded in all cases of default. And then the other one is the same thing. It's fee land, but it is a prorated recovery amount. Covenant requires the amount of NAHASDA funds invested be prorated over the life of the restriction. In the event of a default, only the current prorated amount must be refunded. And there it is for trust land in both cases. Okay, and then there's the FHA loan rider. Those of you that do FHA, you have to use this particular document. You're not allowed to use the other ones regardless of the land type to meet the FHA requirements. Okay, this is a sample of one of the things, because you have to track that household or that property, you know, the unit number, the address, the land status, the unit type, the current owner, the date you assisted, the type of assistance, the amount of the assistance, funding source, you know, requiring the restriction, NAHASDA, the use restriction document, the length of the restriction, and the start and the end date. Okay, so I have seen different language that I've had people ask me for. So the Housing Authority TDHE department retains the right to place a lien on any property assisted with NAHASDA funding subject to the useful life requirements to secure, you know, the housing entity's interest in a conditional grant. The participant shall execute any documents which are necessary to perfect such lien, to ensure that all persons who possess an interest in the subject property timely execute any documents necessary to perfect such lien. The housing entity shall provide the participant with a notice of any such lien in accordance with your applicable law. If the property assisted with funding under the program is trust land, the lease shall be recorded with the Bureau of Indian Affairs Land Titles and Record Office with jurisdiction over the tribe. If such property is fee land, the lien shall be recorded with appropriate county register of deeds. The tribe in its discretion can also record a lien involving trust land with the appropriate county register of deeds. The lien shall remain on the property until the conditional grant is satisfied in full, either by forgiveness or repayment. Until satisfaction of a conditional grant, the housing entity shall release the lien upon satisfaction. Okay. Upon the death of a participant, the decedent's estate shall not be required to repay the conditional grant. The lien shall be released provided the decedent was compliant with the terms of the applicable housing program at the time of death. This is not required language. This is sample language. You know, your governing body might not decide to write it off in event of a death. This is just to help you if you don't have these documents in place. We are not supposed to spend under any circumstance NAHASDA money on taxes, basically. We're not allowed to. Okay. Now, there were monies that came through COVID that allowed that. NAHASDA money, you can't. Okay. So you need language to protect you from that, just in case somebody forgets or whatever the reasons. Housing fund shall not be spent on acquisition, construction, rehab of any home or parcel of land that does not have clear title. Prior to any expenditure, a title search shall be conducted to confirm the title is clear in regard to the land being assisted with those housing funds. For tax compliance, housing funds shall neither be spent on acquisition, construction, or rehab of any home or parcel of land delinquent or facing delinquency in tax payments, nor be used to pay the taxes of any participant in any situation whatsoever. You guys need to make sure that your governing body knows that we're not allowed to do that. Okay, it's like buying alcohol. There's certain things you can't do with those funds. The requirement shall commence at the time the housing funds are first spent, shall continue the entire time in which the housing authority or housing entity has a financial interest in that home or parcel of land as applicable. I'm late. Forgive me, stay around and do Brooke's paperwork, if you will, and come on in tomorrow for that last day. That is enough for today. So if you guys have any answers, I'll get in there and I'll look. Okay. Thank you again for everything that you do. My stuff is here. Take a screenshot of it, whatever you need. And there is her survey.
Yay! Day 4 done. We got one more tomorrow, folks. Day 5 to wrap up the series. Cheryl, you did have a question in the chat from earlier.
I see that. Yep. If a state recognized tribe has tribal preference written in their procurement policy, does that supersede federal? I do not think so. I don't know of anything that supersedes federal Indian preference, but you need to call your HUD office and get an answer on that one. I don't think because you're a state recognized tribe, when you're talking about housing people that you have to put them, that had to do with preference. Okay. There are certain state recognized tribes that received NAHASDA funding. Basically it was under the 37 Act that qualified them. but HUD will give you the clarification there, okay? But when it comes to Indian preference and housing are two different things, okay? The housing of a person.
All right. That webinar feedback survey link is for you guys in the chat. Just takes a few minutes, lets us know what's working, what can be improved upon for the future. And we do share that feedback with our instructors as well. So it's helpful all the way around. We hope you can join us for our 5th and final day. That's going to be tomorrow. Same time, same place. So all of you, because you're on today, that means you are already registered for the learning platform. So you don't have to re-register for day 5. You'll just log in and click on that green banner. And as long as you've logged in at the right time, you'll see it and you'll be able to join just like you did today. I will post the recording tomorrow morning. You can watch it here on the website in the courses section, or it'll be on our YouTube channel as well if you need to share that with anybody or if you maybe missed a section. We encourage you to check out all of our recorded webinars that are on there. They go back about 2 years. A lot of helpful resources in there. Feel free to check out our upcoming training events. We post about them on our social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter. If you are a podcast listener, we have an in-house produced podcast, the Hope a Thing, a Native American podcast. You can listen to that wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can watch the videos on our YouTube as well. All right, folks. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate that you could spend your morning or your afternoon anywhere. So it's absolutely fantastic that you use it to improve your skill set and that you spend it with us for the webinar. So we really appreciate you, and we hope to see you back for our final day 5 of the series tomorrow. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but I'll leave the meeting room open so that you guys can grab that link for the feedback survey from the chat.